Mr. Dustin Pickett. I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor E. Suresh Kumar, Registrar, Professor K. Narasimha Rao, and our Dean, Professor Haribandi Lakshmi. A very warm welcome to our Dean of Academics and Head, Department of English Literature, Professor Sampson, and all our faculty members and staff who have joined us here today. I once again heartily welcome you all. Now to begin with, I would like to call up Ms. Anusha to introduce our resource person for the day. Thank you, Asha. So I have the pleasure of introducing our resource person today, Mr. Dustin Pickett, a critic, reviewer, essayist, musician, and visual artist. Dustin Pickett is editor-in-chief of Harping Asylum, an award-nominated literary journal that publishes quarterly and has been doing so for 12 years. And he's also the founder of Transcending Zero Press. As a publisher, he has released over 100 books in 13 years. He has contributed writing to Huffington Post, Cafe Dissensus Every Day, The Statesman, Journal of Liberty and International Affairs, The Colorado Review, World Literature Today, and several other publications. His publishers include Avaku Publishers in India, as well as Alien Buddha Press, Setu, and Venetian Spiral Press in the USA. He has published 14 books to date. He has edited several best-selling anthologies, including Selfhood, Varieties of Experience, and released a newly selected volume of EFLU Masters' Course, edited by Ryan Group. He has also edited and published the new Contemporary Albanian Poetry in English, which is now archived at Rutgers University. He was a finalist in the Adelaide Literary Journal's first short fiction contest, and the friends of Guido Bozzano in Italy have bestowed an honorable mention to him on 2 separate occasions for his book. Friendswood Public Library granted him a jury prize for an acrostic poem in 2021. He was longlisted for the Naveem Karim World Prize in 2022 and given the honor of Knight of World Peace by the World Peace Institute that very same year. So he hosts the popular interview series World Thinkers Network on YouTube. Previously known as PAL Literary Corner, he has interviewed hundreds of creatives over the period of 2 years for the program. He also anchors the program Foreign Policy Review for Parrot TV and conducts webinars on literature. So I'm sure this interaction with our guests will be a very valuable and enriching experience for all of us. With that, I invite Mr. Dustin Pickett to address our esteemed gathering. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, and I would like to express my gratitude to the Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor E. Suresh Kumar and the Head Professor T. Sampson Thomas. And I'm going to begin a little bit with a talk about myself, and then I'll get into my written speech. So when I was in 5th grade, which is approximately 11 to 12 years old, I won a poetry contest for a poem concerning environmentalism, and my teacher, Mrs. Martin, was very pleased, of course, and it was very encouraging for me to have won this contest, and it sort of put me on this general idea that I could be a writer. And given a few years, my teenage years, I was introduced to Sylvia Plath's poetry, and I did have doubts throughout the years whether or not I could be a writer, because it's a very difficult profession, and of course, there was times when I even asked God Himself, like, how can I do this? Is this really possible for me? And silently, God worked His ways and pushed me in the right direction. In my opinion, some people don't believe in God, but I personally do. And then I picked up, like a Poets Market, which is a volume of listing of publishers in my early teenage years, and I thought, man, this is a massive volume. This is a lot of publishers that may want to read my work. So how do I decide who or what to send to? And at first I did not think to do that, but I did many years later pick up another volume, because they come out every year. I picked up another volume and I wrote to a publisher, Abraxas Magazine, and sent my poetry, and they finally got back with me. I had expressed interest in one of their writers, and they wrote back to me to purchase a book by that writer, which was really funny for me, because I was hoping they would say something about the poetry. But anyway, further down the line, I learned a little bit about from mostly from reading my own literature that I had collected these books over the years for several years, and I would just read by myself in my apartment in Alvin, Texas, and I. A lot of times when I was growing up, there were books that I couldn't afford or I couldn't have, and so I would try to write those books. If I wanted a book and I didn't actually, wasn't able to get it, I would try to write my own version of that book. And so, fast forward a few more years to about 2017, I had a poet that I was publishing, Henry Seven Renaud Jr., who visited me here in Houston from California, because we were publishing his book, and he basically told me, hey man, your poetry's really great. You should start sending this off to publishers. And so I started doing that, and I had quite a bit of luck at first. Ended up getting a lot, maybe 4 or 5 published right off the bat, just sending them out, and they were taken in. One of them was taken by Seltzer magazine, which is based in with Johns Hopkins University, or students that of Johns Hopkins were the editors there, and I had a lot of good luck. So it really was very encouraging, and basically those experiences started to form and shape me as a writer, and take me into the spectrum of learning more about how the writing business works. And I had started the journal Harbinger Asylum in 2010, just to basically to get my foot in the door. I didn't think that I would be able to be a writer. So this was my initial step, was starting my own literary journal in 2010, and I based on models like Octavio Paz, for instance. He was also kind of involved in creating his own literary magazine, and he ended up becoming a Nobel Prize winner. So he's an excellent example of somebody that I believe that I looked up to early on, and going forward, it was very, very difficult and very tricky to be involved in the writing profession, and so I gradually grew into it, and after starting the journal and starting my own press, it became something synonymous with me. So with that said, I'm going to go into my written portion of my speech, which is called Poetry as an Act of Creation: Why Create in the Age of Scandal? The first question that comes to mind is, what does poetry do? In what way is poetry philosophically attuned? Is it even realistic to expect people to read when poetry is like a foreign language to most readers? I'll start by answering the first question. As I come from an existentialist background, I believe in the process of action in creating meaning. So what does poetry offer in the realm of doing? How is poetry a kind of praxis? The simple truth is text can only instigate the mind, and through our mind it challenges perceptions. It seems reading is only done seriously by a select committed few, and as Nikki Giovanni wrote, I think we are always preaching to the saved. However, as a serious Christian, I believe in reaching the damned as well. So how do we do this? In a world so obsessed with celebrity, scandal, and social media style broadcasts, a world that will shut you down for saying offensive things, how do we participate in the scandal? Should we consider as poets and writers the art of scandal? Is the only way to enrich and reach lives in this day and age? To stray from social criticism a bit, I believe poetry can offer meaning where other things cannot or refuse to do so. It is important to develop meaning, and I believe poetry's innate ambiguity can arouse the sympathies for the mind in ways scandal cannot. It can tune the mind, develop it, prepare it for deep thinking. Poetry can instigate and arouse too. For instance, see these lines by my friend, the poet Ken Jones, in his poem, Diversities Digitize the Divine. We all believe our stigmata are unique. On the cyberspace scriptorium, monks preserve monkey knowledge. The reality of prayer transmogrified into a terminal access to the nexus, at once trapped in a spot, yet everywhere and nowhere. Later he writes these lines: "Your bloody sweat fools no one into knowing nothing is something. Prophetic communications abate when dog orgies dissipate." The phrase dog orgies may arouse scandalous thoughts, but in the least we are thinking correct. I quote these lines because they are also confound logic, although it seems obvious that the poet is referring to the tendency of the digital age to allow us to broadcast our civilized dilemmas. Poetry has a powerful way of confounding logic. In the words of critic Ryan Ruby, writing on John Ashbery's poetry in The Nation, it tends to be composed of grammatically well-formed units combined in such a way as to produce semantically nonsensical wholes. Is it possible that by some stroke of luck poetry exists in the liminal spaces, or is there some kind of science to reach this confounded logic? I will go back to this later. For now, I want to continue on the line which I began, namely the age of scandal and how poetry fits in. As Shelley reminds us, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. What he means by this is poets are creators of myth, which sustains a power so great over the human imagination that it guides and directs human action. Religious writings are essentially myths, and even though poetry does not appeal to the hive mind, it still has power to captivate and inspire people, almost subliminally. The economist John Maynard Keynes says, "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slave of some defunct economist. Just replace economist with poet, and it is likely still true. Our best minds are inspired through rendezvous with poetry and writing. Gandhi, for instance, was deeply inspired by Henry David Thoreau. Is it truly poetry's purpose to quote-unquote fit in? Why then should it appeal to the strongest minds, the minds of those whose actions broadcast their nonconformist approach to life? Thoreau himself refused to pay taxes to support the Mexican-American War, and he landed in prison only to be bailed out by his aunt. While in prison, his friend Emerson visited and asked, 'Why are you in prison, Henry?' To which he responded, 'Why are you not?' Thoreau, the quintessential American anarchist, inspired Gandhi. Imagine the power of such a reach across years, across continents. Why does poetry appeal to our greatest thinkers? And yes, Thoreau also wrote poetry. Let's ask Thoreau himself. Thoreau wrote, "Poetry is the only life got, the only work done, the only pure product and free labor of man, performed only when he has put all the world under his feet and conquered the last of his foes. Good poetry seems so simple and natural a thing that when we need it, we wonder that all men are not always poets." Imagine the power of such a thing. Poetry is written after one has the world under their feet and conquered the last of his foes. How does it become marginalized? Why has there not been a golden age of poetry recently? Byron's The Corsair sold 10,000 copies in London in one day. Rupi Kaur, today's best-selling poet, has sold millions of books, yet people at large don't read much poetry. What value could it have? Poetry has a distinct power to bring discrete sets into unison. It has the ability to ask the right questions for which only the reader has an answer to satisfy. As an example, let's listen to Neruda. He writes in his Book of Questions, "What do you call a flower that flits from bird to bird? Which birds dictate the order of the flock while it flies? Who shouted for joy at the birth of the color blue? When I look once more at the sea, does the sea see me or not see me?" It seems upon reflection he answers his own questions within the lines as they proceed, but he gives the reader the impetus to do so without infringement. Reading poetry is a process, sometimes a long one. Poetry should be read slowly, and no one can tell you how to read a great poem. I have developed several possible modes of poetry, 5 to be exact. Let's discuss those modes for a moment. Poetry as cultural ambassadorship. Poetry as therapy. Poetry as mythology. Poetry as protest. Poetry as experience. Art as experience. Poetry, although written best in solitude during grueling moments, is a cultural expression. In fact, Neruda, previously mentioned, is such a power in Chile that they wanted to name an airport for him. He was actually poisoned in an act of political assassination. He was also ambassador for Chile to France. Poets are language's trustees. They understand language profoundly. Poetry is also therapeutic. Writing poetry actually has medical advantages. According to a paper published at the National Library of Medicine, poetry creates avenues for self-expression that cannot be felt through the other means of communication. This in itself can be a healing and restorative process, a self-guided therapy that allows us to strengthen our mental health and connection to ourselves and to those around us. Human beings write poetry to communicate deep feeling. As confessional poet Anne Sexton wrote in Admonitions to a Special Person, "Watch out for intellect, because it knows so much it knows nothing, and leaves you hanging upside down, mouthing knowledge as your heart falls out of your mouth." Poetry has the wild ability to confound intellect, to intellectualize the emotions. What more could the age of scandal need? The playwright Aeschylus wrote, "Words are the physicians of a mind diseased." I have already quoted Shelley and discussed poetry's relationship to myth. Myth's social function is to give meaning to the seemingly most inane aspects of life. Myth is a broad category, to be honest with you. It includes important scriptures such as the Holy Bible and the Vedas as well. I do not mean to say these are myths in the sense they are untrue. No, they are completely true. Myths cloak truth and mystery in the same manner as poetry. Myth is God's word distilled over ages. Myth exposes God to the world in powerful ways. You may not believe in God, but this word God is merely a signifier for something greater than us. God encompasses the laws of nature, everything living and dead, the extremely obscure aspects to our existence, everything you do not know or understand, mystery. Hence the myth, which serves as a divine communication for all that bridges us as beings in the world, the sacred and profane, the multi-layered and difficult aspect of human understanding. Myth is transcendental. Poetry also communicates protest and illumines historical moments. For instance, take this segment from Milton's epic Paradise Lost, Book 8.